Everyone, welcome. I hope everyone's having a great day and has had a great first 3 weeks of your summer at TFAS. It's wonderful to see all of you this evening. This is a special night for us, one of the highlights of the summer, because we'll be having a lecture honoring Professor Lev Dobriansky, who was just key to TFAS history as our first director when he was a professor at Georgetown University. And you'll hear a little bit about him before I introduce our speaker. But we honor him by creating this lecture in political economy for students every summer. And you're in for a treat, I think, with the person we selected to give the lecture this summer. But first, I'd like to call on Professor Paula Dobriansky, the Honorable Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, who serves on the TFAS Board of Trustees and is a key person in advising us on our programs, especially internationally, but also here in the US. Ambassador Dobriansky served for 8 years as the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs in a portfolio that included issues of democracy, women's rights, water, climate change, human rights, really a lot of very important issues for the United States to grapple with around the world. She was ambassador to Northern Ireland, to the talks there to bring peace, and has served in a lot of other capacities in academia, at Harvard, at the Naval Academy, and in the whole range of foreign policy organizations like the Atlantic Council and others. So I'm not up here to introduce her, but I would like Ambassador Dobriansky to please come up and say a few things about her father. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Lev Dobriansky Lecture. I'm always very excited about this time of the year because it really is, I'd say for my family, a privilege and an honor to have this lecture named after my dad. And it's been, I think, very special and also very memorable because my father was very dedicated to the very mission of the Fund for American Studies. So first, let me say thank you, Roger, for that introduction. And also, Randy Teague, I wanted to recognize you there as, you know, our loyal chair, et cetera, with the trustees. And also to Steve Hanke, thank you so much for coming this evening and being the lecturer. I understand he's going to enlighten us all about inflation this evening, so we're looking forward to that. Very much forward to hearing your thoughts in that regard. But let me say a few words about my dad. And the first is the mission of the Fund for American Studies itself. When I look at it, and with its founding in 1967, I was thinking, wow, it was very focused on furthering, educating on the ideas of liberty, limited government, and free markets. And you, as coming into this program, this is what you are engaged in and learning about. So with that, let me start with the fact that a number of years ago, the Washington Times wrote about my father. They said, quote, "It is rare that a man dreams big, dedicates his life to a project, and sees it to fruition before his death." Well, that is, in fact, I would say, what did, in fact, happen with my father, Ambassador Lev Dobriansky. He was a scholar, he was an educator, an American patriot, and also, I would say, just a relentless anti-communist. At the time that my father was not only a professor, but in his years growing up, we had then the Soviet Union, and he believed that the old communist-controlled Soviet Union was a prison of nations, and that this arrangement was so inimical to the human spirit and the very desire of people for self-governance and self-determination that it would never, ever last. He authored what was known as the Captive Nations Week resolution, which, by the way, every president since Eisenhower forward, since 1959, has issued a presidential declaration recognizing the third week of July and basically pledging the support of the American people toward the freedom and the self-determination of those enslaved and those captive abroad. So legislation came forward, the Captive Nations Week resolution. It was passed by Congress in '59. My dad was tireless in lecturing, testifying, and he really wrote rather endlessly about how fragile he saw then the Soviet Union was and the Soviet Empire. And he was urging that US policy, that our policies toward Moscow had to take this into account, that the way they should be crafted would take into account this fragility. Many at the time really countered his argumentation. I think most had expected that the empire would endure. Well, it did not. But now we've also seen that Putin's Russia has relapsed into authoritarianism. We've seen the invasion of Ukraine as an unwarranted, unprovoked attack on Ukraine on February 24 of this year. And the fact, at the same time, though, we also saw years back that the Soviet empire's formerly captive nations have become free, a number of them. I think about Poland, I think about the Baltic states, for example, and there are others. And they have embraced democracy and free markets. So the collapse of Soviet communism had, one could argue, a number of causes. The forces of nationalism and the desire of self-determination, in my view, as espoused and articulated by my father, I would say were among some of the most important factors that did contribute to its dismantlement. And I think when you look at what is playing out in Ukraine today, you are seeing a strongly held view of one's history, of one's culture, of one's language. And when it was said by Putin that Ukraine is not a nation, well, it could be no further, it could be certainly no further than the truth in this case. The Ukrainian people are fighting valiantly for their independence, for getting rid of that illegal occupation of not only the Donbass area, but also the illegal annexation of Crimea. So I would just say that the tie here and the underpinning is really the fact of freedom, the promotion of freedom, liberty, free market forces. And I think that every lecture that has really basically been delivered here, that tie has always been interwoven, no matter what the topic is. And the topic could be purely domestic focused, it could be more internationally focused. But I just want to say I'm so delighted again for the fund for naming this lecture after my dad. And thank you again, Professor Steve Hanke. We're very privileged to have you today. So please, I hope you'll welcome him. Roger's coming back to introduce Professor Hanke, but I hope you certainly will enjoy the lecture, and thanks for being here this evening. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. You got a great sense of Paula Dobriansky's father, Lev Dobriansky, and you can read more if you Google it, look at Wikipedia. I might also point out that Paula Dobriansky and our chairman, Randy Teague, serve on the board of a new museum that's open in Washington, D.C., the Victims of Communism Memorial Museum, which is roughly in the vicinity of between the White House and Ford's Theater. So it's the newest museum, so find time to visit there. It doesn't take a long time. It's just opened, and exhibits have been established, and more will be added, but it's worth your while to visit. Well, I can't think of a more timely topic for us to hear about tonight, the topic being looking for inflation in all the wrong places. When I was a college student, inflation was the issue. I remember a professor I knew wrote a book called The Age of Inflation. We were living in the 70s with all sorts of problems caused by rising prices, shortages, you could say supply chain issues. Chairman Randy Teague and I were in a meeting of our investment committee today at TFAS, and we got a report from our investment managers that had pointed out the causes of inflation, and they were everything from, high oil prices to the world's view of the dollar to supply chain problems. There's a long list of things that caused inflation, and I think tonight we'll get a better understanding of what exactly inflation is and maybe some insights as to what to do about it. Professor Steve Hanke is professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University. He's the founder and co-director there of the Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, distinguished professor at several universities, Universitas Pelita Harapan in Jakarta, Indonesia, senior advisor to Renmin University in Beijing, special counselor to the Center for Financial Stability in New York, a member of the National Bank of Kuwait's International Advisory Board, a member of the Financial Advisory Board of the United Arab Emirates, and a contributing editor to Globe Asia magazine. He currently serves as chairman of the Richmond Group Fund, a macro hedge fund located in Richmond, Virginia. When he was previously president of the Toronto Trust Argentina in Buenos Aires, it was the world's best performing emergent market fund in 1995. He's taught at many other universities. I think I first met Professor Hanke when he served as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors in the early 1980s. He also has been a senior advisor to the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress. He's been an advisor or counselor of sorts to both the Republic of Lithuania and the Republic of Montenegro, an advisor to the presidents of Bulgaria, Venezuela, and Indonesia. So he knows his stuff, you can tell by the work he's done in his career. He's helped establish new currency regimes for Argentina, Estonia. We have an Estonian here tonight, I know, Bulgaria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Ecuador, Lithuania, and Montenegro. So I could go on with other things. He's received multiple honorary doctorates from universities around the world. He was named one of the 25 most influential people in 1998 by World Trade magazine. Written many books. That's enough from me. Please give a warm TFAS welcome to Professor Steve Hanke.
Thank you very much, Roger. It's great to be here this evening, and we do have a hot topic. Sometimes these things never work out. You get kind of a dud for a topic, and everyone's going to sleep at the wheel as you're trying to give a lecture. But tonight we're going to talk about inflation, and I think the best way for me to start talking about inflation is to take the extreme case of hyperinflation. And I think once you get a little bit of a taste of hyperinflation and the causes of hyperinflation, you'll be able to grasp what's going on in the current debate in the United States as well as in some other places. Europe, the UK are also suffering from high rates of inflation right now. So hyperinflation, there have been 62 hyperinflations, and hyperinflations, the standard practice in the economics profession is to define a hyperinflation as one in which the inflation rate's 50% per month or greater. And there, as I say, there have been 62 of these. They aren't all that common, but let me just run down a couple of them to give you a little bit of a taste of how high the inflation rates really can go. The world record was Hungary in 1946. July of 1946, the daily inflation rate, the daily rate was 207%, and prices were doubling every 15 hours. That's the world's record. Now, number two is actually fairly current. November of 2008, we saw Zimbabwe's inflation rate peak out, and that was at 98% per day. So every 24.7 hours, the prices were doubling. It's hard to believe, but that was happening in Zimbabwe in November of 2008. And then we dropped down to Yugoslavia, which happens to be one that I know quite a bit about. That one occurred, the peak, in January of 1994 at 313 million% a month. Now I'm going back, I can go back to the month, and it's 313 million% in 1 month. So the daily rate, 64.6%, and the doubling of prices every 1.41 days. And notice, Germany, I haven't gotten to Germany yet. I mean, when you think of hyperinflation, everybody says, oh, the German hyperinflation, that was the big one. Well, it was big, but it wasn't even close to the ones that I've just listed above. On October 1923, the peak rate was 20.9% per day, so it took 3.7 days to double the prices. Now look at the difference between that and Hungary. Hungary was doubling every 15 hours. It was taking about 3.5 days in Germany. So it was a big hyperinflation, but not even close to the top. Now, one, I will mention Bulgaria because I was involved in really stopping the Bulgarian hyperinflation. That one peaked out in February of 1997, 242% per month. So it was big, but it's way down on the list, like 15th or something like that. So at any rate, why do these hyperinflations occur? Well, they occur because the government is spending money, and for some reason, the tax receipts aren't coming in. And as a result, you have a huge fiscal deficit. Now, why don't the tax receipts come in? If you look at Hungary, it was right after the war, and the tax administration was completely fouled up. Zimbabwe, of course, you had Mugabe there for a long time, and the place was pretty dysfunctional, and no taxes were really being collected to speak of, but there were a lot of expenditures. In Yugoslavia, you had government expenditures. You had Milosevic was in power. Taxes were not being collected. No one was paying their taxes. And you had a situation where at that point, what happens? Government spending up, no taxes coming in, a huge deficit, and all of these countries were not in the international bond market, so they couldn't finance the deficit by selling bonds internationally. And locally, the banks were up to here with the bonds the government was issuing and didn't want any more bonds because the banks would have probably ended up going insolvent if they weren't already insolvent beforehand. So the government goes to the central bank, and basically the government fiscal authorities are holding a pistol, and the central bank governor says, yes, I agree. Those bonds you want to sell us are wonderful. I'm going to buy them. And how do they buy them? They literally turn on the printing presses. They create credit and loan it to the government. The government gives them worthless bonds in exchange. But notice, this operation expands the money supply very, very rapidly. So government spending up, tax deficiencies for financing, and no bond possibilities in the international or domestic market, and the central bank is kind of the lender of last resort, shall we say, to finance a deficit. And when they do that, they do it by creating money. I mean, literally crediting the government's account. And what does the government do? Gives them the bonds. So that's the process with these hyperinflations, and it should be fairly easy to kind of grasp that you're just creating huge amounts of money. And for example, I think I maybe mentioned, maybe didn't mention, but in Yugoslavia, about 97% of all the government expenditures at this peak period in January of 1994, they were actually being financed by the central bank, printing new Yugoslav dinars, or credit to the government account denominated in Yugoslav dinars. So let's look at the United States, because we are at an interesting point. We're at the highest inflation rate we've had in 40 years. I mean, none of you are 40 years old, so, well, maybe a few are 40 years old, but in general, you're probably not even 20 years old, let alone 40 years old. But the inflation rate is 8.6% per year in the United States now, and that is the highest it's been in 40 years. So the question is something that Roger alluded to, and that is we're looking for the causes of inflation in all the wrong places. The cause is always and everywhere the central bank, just like those hyperinflation cases. The hyperinflation is all caused by central banks creating a massive mountains of money. And this is literally too much money chasing too few goods. That line you probably heard, and that's what it's all about. Too much money chasing too few goods, and the price level goes up. So the U.S. rate, if we go back to about the middle of last year in July 20th, actually, John Greenwood and I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, and we had a model, and we ran the model, and we predicted that right now inflation would be 6%, or we said it might be as high as 9%. So it's 8.6. We pretty much hit the bullseye with that article that was published a year ago. At the time, everybody thought we were really out there completely. Remember, team temporary, inflation was going to be temporary. You've read that in the newspaper 100 times. They finally dropped that story since it's drug on for quite a while. So we had first team temporary. This is a temporary little aberration, the uptick in inflation. It was actually 5.4% last July when we wrote the article. But they said, don't worry about it, it's going to go away very quickly. Then we had, COVID is causing inflation, and we had supply chains. You've read about supply chains for a year, now you're still reading about them. If you're listening to the White House, the cause, of course, is Putin, and Putin is causing oil prices to go up and food prices to go up, and as a result, we've got inflation. Well, we also have the story a little bit like team temporary, and that is that we have a global problem. In other words, this is some global thing. Well, inflations aren't global. Notice those hyperinflations that I gave you. Those were specific countries at specific times. Inflations are always created by central banks, and they are always local. And if you look at the current scene, what do we have? We have 8.6% inflation in the United States, but China, the inflation rate is 2.1%. Or Japan, the inflation rate is 2.5%. Or Switzerland, the inflation rate is 2.9%. Now those are a lot lower than the United States. They're lower than the UK. They're lower than a lot lower than Europe also. So we don't have a global problem. And this gets into something that's very important in the contemporary setting when you're talking about inflation, and that's more or less everything you read about, it's just wrong. And this gets into my Hanke's 95% rule. And the Hanke 95% rule is that 95% of what you read in the press is either wrong or irrelevant. And it could be higher when you're talking about inflation. I think it's probably over 99% of what you're reading in the newspaper is just wrong about the causes, what's causing this. So the question is, why did everyone miss it? They have all these ad hoc reasons for inflation and the explanation of it. And the question is, well, why did they get it wrong? Well, let's start at the beginning. The beginning was when COVID did start from February 2020 going forward. Remember, President Trump was in office then. The Fed, in response to the COVID problem, started increasing the money supply very dramatically. The big, huge increases were actually in 2020 when President Trump was still president. But it was coming from the Fed. And what was going on? Well, the government expenditures were going up rapidly, and the deficit was going up rapidly because tax receipts weren't following. And the Fed stepped in and did what we call monetizing the debt. They were buying the bonds. Instead of the Treasury selling the bonds to the non-bank public, to you, they were selling the bonds to the Fed. And how did the Fed pay for those? They credited the government's account and created dollars. And we had a very rapid increase in the rate of growth in the money supply. Since February of 2020, the cumulative increase in the money supply measured by M2, which is a broad measure, the broadest measure actually that the Fed uses to measure its money supply, has gone up about 41%. So the average increase in the rate of growth in the money supply on an annual basis has been, a little under 18% per annum since February of 2020. That's the highest rate on average we've had since World War II. This is a very rapid increase in the rate of growth in the money supply. Now, what happens, there's kind of a sequence of things that happens. Once the money supply starts growing, the first thing that happens is that asset prices go up. And with a lag of about 1 to 9 months, asset prices start going up. So what happened after February 2020? Asset prices started going up. Well, what are assets? Stocks are assets. The stock market boomed. Anyone who wasn't fully invested in the stock market really was missing out on a gravy train. Real estate prices were going up. Automobiles, remember used cars? The used car prices started surging back then. You probably read a lot about that. Those are real assets. So that's the first thing that happens. Then the second thing that happens in the sequence of things is that with a lag of 6 to 18 months, real economic activity picks up. And remember, we had some very hot quarters of GDP growth, very, very, very high. We had a big, sharp bounce back from the little tiny recession that we had, or little slump that we had after COVID started. Then things shot up very quickly. Well, that was with this typical lag of 6 to 18 months. Then the last thing that happens after the monetary injection goes in, with a lag of about 12 to 24 months, is inflation kicks in. So we've seen a typical pattern of monetary acceleration, very rapid growth, and you get the sequence that I just gave you with these three things going on: asset prices going up, then economic activity, then inflation. Now, the question is, well, why did Greenwood and I get this thing right? And we got it right because we actually have a model, the quantity theory of money. And the quantity theory of money has been around since the 16th century. used by many economists over time. In the 20th century, the most noted economist that was a quantity theory person was Professor Friedman, Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate in economics, professor at Chicago for many years. Now, what is the quantity theory of money? The quantity theory of money is captured by something called the equation of exchange, and it's a simple identity, MV, money times velocity of money, and the velocity of money is just the GDP divided by the money supply. So that's the velocity, how fast the money is turning over in the economy. So MV equals PY, and P is a price level, and Y is real economic activity. So MV equals PY. It works like a charm and always has been, and is very reliable, and it is an identity, what we call an identity in economics. It's true by definition. MV is just the amount that's being spent, and PY is the amount that's being received. So MV equals PY. That's the quantity theory. So if you look at the last 60 years in the United States, and you look, it's by the way, this equation of exchange is really a model for predicting national income determination, where the nominal GDP is going. And remember, the nominal GDP is just the real GDP plus inflation. That's the nominal GDP. So if you want to know where that's going, use the equation of exchange. If you look at the last 60 years in the United States, we've had M3, using that measure, has gone up on average 7.3% per year, and nominal GDP has gone up 6.4% per year. If you look at the 10 years going into 2019, not counting this kind of aberration in 2020, but the 10 years going into 2019, M3 grew at an average rate of 3.8% per year, and nominal GDP went up 4% per year. So there's this close relationship between the growth rate in broad money, either M2, M3, or you can even, if you go to the Center for Financial Stability, you get M4. There's a close relationship between the growth rate in the money supply and the growth rate in nominal GDP. Now, let me go quickly using the equation of exchange, MV equals PY. If you solve that for M, the money supply, and we determine or identify that M that we're solving for, and the example I'm going to give you is what I call a golden growth rate. That's the rate of growth in the money supply that would allow the Federal Reserve to hit its inflation target of 2%. So it's about 5 or 6% right now, the number. So to plug the equation in, you're solving for M, so you take V over to the other side of the identity, and that means you have minus V, so you have P, the percentage, you're going to have the percentage change in M equals the percentage change in P. Well, that's the inflation target of the Fed, 2%. So that P is 2%. You plug the 2% in, and Y is roughly the real potential growth rate in the U.S. economy is a little over 2%. So just put in 2%. And then we've got this V thing. And what about V? Well, V has been on a trend, a steady trend of minus 1.7% per year. Excuse me, 1.8%. I was a little off, but let's just call it 2, just to keep things simple. So we have a minus for velocity, and we have a minus because we've taken it over to the right-hand side of the equation. So you have 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals what? 6. So that's more or less the golden growth rate. And remember I said that the average growth rate has been what since COVID? The average, annual average, is about 18%. So the growth rate is about 3 times greater than the golden growth rate. So you know you have a lot of inflation coming into the economy because the money supply is growing very rapidly. Go back, think hyperinflation, and then start thinking about what's going on in the United States, and you're going to come up with really the right answer. So let me use this kind of image. Think of a monetary bathtub, and we'll think of a monetary bathtub with a golden growth rate. The golden growth rate is 6%. That is going to allow you to hit the inflation target of 2%. So you've got coming in the faucet, money coming in at 6% per year, okay? And the bathtub has 2 drains in it. One drain drains out for real GDP growth, and that, remember, is about 2%. So you're draining 2% of the 6%. 2 percentage points of the 6 percentage points are being drained out to accommodate real economic growth. Then the other drain does what? That is a drain that accommodates the real increase in the demand for money, because as the economy grows, you need more money, demanding more money. And that's that 2%. You invert the velocity and you get what's called a Cambridge K, and that's the demand for money. That's 2%. And what goes in the overflow that's left? You got 2% left. You've taken put 6% in the tub. You've taken 2% out to accommodate real economic activity, 2% out, 2 percentage points out to accommodate the demand for money growth, and you're left with 2 percentage points in the tub that goes in the overflow, and the overflow is the inflation overflow. Now, what you've had since COVID, we've had about 41% increase going into the tub, and if you take what's going out both drains, that takes about 10 percentage points out of or off of the 41% that's gone in. And what do you have left in the tub? You've got about a 30% increase in the money supply that's going to eventually go in the overflow and come out as inflation in the economy. It's excess money that's been created by the Fed. So where are we going? I think what we're going to see is a continuation of inflation, because no matter what the Fed does, we have this excess money that's in the tub and still is draining out and going into inflation overflow. So I think we will have 7% inflation by the end of this year. In other words, in December, the year-over-year inflation rate, it really almost mathematically can't be below 7%. And if we go to 2023, I think we'll probably still be 5 or 6% inflation, no matter what the Fed does. Now, the big problem with the Fed is that the Fed's kind of flying blind, because they don't use the quantity theory of money. Chairman Powell has testified actually before Congress, indicating that we have to unlearn the quantity theory of money. We have to unlearn the theory of everything, MV equals PY. So that's the position of the Fed. They haven't been looking at the money supply, and that's why they were not able to predict what was going to happen with the money supply. They have, by the way, at the Fed, 785 economists in the system, and none of them got it right. So you have a lot of economists, and they just didn't get it right. So whether they will be able to rein things in maybe they're going to get lucky. They say they want to rein things in. I would argue that they're flying blind because they're not looking at the money supply, and they're really kind of grasping at straws in terms of what they will be doing to rein in the inflation, which they are pretty much panicked about inflation. It's a big number, and it's jumped up surprisingly even in the last few months. So the question is, why did all these economists at the Fed fail to predict inflation? Well, one thing is they deep six the quantity theory of money. Okay, that's fine. And why have they been talking about all these ad hoc reasons like supply chains and Putin and all these other things? Well, that is a simple thing. I mean, I know a lot of you are apparently in government or taking courses in political science, and this is a covering your rear end kind of operation. We didn't do it. The other, you notice, it was always somebody else. I mean, Putin is, of course, the most recent thing, but it's the supply chains did it. It's a global problem, whatever that is. It's a temporary problem, whatever that is. But no one ever gets down to money causing inflation. In other words, the Fed has not come out there and they said, we got this wrong. We didn't realize that the rapid rate of growth in the money supply was going to result in inflation. And one reason for that is that the post-Keynesian models that we've had in graduate courses in particular in the last 30 years, they don't contain money. So there's a problem with the models. They don't have the right models. They're not using MV equals PY, believe me. I mean, those are openly mocked by, in fact, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Powell, has literally mocked the quantity theory of money and indicated that it's out of date and irrelevant. So they're using different models. And I would argue also that there is a political element in this. If you look at the number of economists at headquarters at the Fed, you've got 416 economists, and the ratio of Democrats to Republicans is 48.5 to 1. Now, who is really one of the enemy number one public intellectuals of the Democrats? Well, Milton Friedman. He's of course no longer with us, unfortunately, but he's all over the place. You can check hundreds, if not thousands, of YouTube lectures and interviews and so forth with Milton Friedman. He just drives the Democrats nuts. In fact, Joe Biden proudly proclaimed in 2020, as he was campaigning, that Milton, in quotes, Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore. That's what President Biden said before he was elected. Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore. So there is a, shall we say, political aspect to why they didn't get it right and why they didn't use the right models, because the quantity theory is joined at the hip with Milton Friedman. I mean, he was the biggest practitioner and advocate of the quantity theory of money in the 20th century, without a doubt. So I think with that, I will open things up for questions and answers.
We're going to ask that you line up at the microphone and just say your name and where you go to school. And one question. There's a microphone on this side as well if you want to get to the front of the line.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jack Villa. I'm a rising sophomore at Boston College. And I was wondering if you were in charge of the Fed in March of 2020, what would you have done to combat the beginning of the COVID pandemic?
I would have kept the money supply growing at about 5 or 6%. Steady as you go. And And if that would have been the case, we certainly wouldn't have this inflation. And then you say, well, how would the government have financed itself? They had this huge deficit. They would have sold the bonds that they were issuing to the non-bank public. So, Jack, you'd be buying bonds, and your disposable income would go down a little bit, and they'd hand you a piece of paper. You get the bond, or, well, it would probably be in some electronic form, so you wouldn't have to fool with the paper. But that would have been a situation where you wouldn't have had inflation. A lot of people think that if government expenditures go up and the deficit goes up, that you have inflation. No, you not necessarily. If the deficit is monetized and financed by the central bank, you will have inflation, because then you get MV equals PY cranked up and going. But you can have a lot of government expenditures, a lot of deficits, and if they are financed by selling bonds to the non-bank public, you're not going to have inflation associated with it. And all those hyperinflation cases, by the way, the deficit was hugely monetized, massive.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Okay, yeah, we'll go.
Good evening, sir. I'm Ben Sabo from Hungary, so we experienced, at least my parents experienced firsthand the problems of the inflation. So we already have...
Yeah, what country?
Hungary.
Hungary. Oh, okay. So you
we lost.
By the way, I have had Hungarian students who have brought me very nice bills from the hyperinflation. I have them hanging in my office.
400 quadruple million is quite a nice amount, I must say. I want to turn the direction of this discussion in a way that for a long time, Hungary looked at the West, even in the socialistic times, as a place which can relieve us of our financial burdens. So let's say, take a look at the IMF. My question is, from this crisis, do you see a possibility that nations all over the world can find their unique individual solutions to this inflation problem? And do you think that this crisis can turn countries towards the direction of China, for example, or East to find our financial problems? Or do you see that this global thing can only be solved together, or countries one by one can solve this problem on their own?
Well, the only way to solve it's one by one. If you're focused on inflation, the only way to solve it's one by one, because inflations are created locally, not internationally.
Sure. But with this supply crisis, in this way, can one country be a relief for us all, or the US providing credits for us, or anything?
Well, if you talked about looking at the East, if you do look at the East right now, generally their inflations are much more under control because their money supplies are much more under control. So I said China, the inflation rate's only 2.1% in China, but if you look at some of the other Asian countries, even, I don't have it right at my fingertips right now, but even Indonesia's doing fairly well, another big Asian country, and Japan, obviously. You have to, again, you have to think clearly and deeply about things, and this identity, MV equals PY, that is the theory of everything. In macroeconomics, that's it. If you understand that identity and know how to use it, you will have the answer to the macroeconomic situation, because you will be able to anticipate where nominal GDP is actually going, and you'll have a good handle on it. And you won't get confused by all of the talk about it's a food crisis, it's a supply chain, it's ships stuck in the Black Sea that can't get out, and you name it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor. My name is Ali. I'm an international student from Pakistan. And my question to you is that my country right now is, like analysts are estimating that inflation is going to be in 45 percentage points by the end of this year. And do you think that putting the country on gray lists like the FATF had an impact on pushing that amount of inflation in the country? And do you think it's really safe for the international community that a country with the fifth largest population in the world, and specifically a nuclear-armed country, it going into such a financial crisis where you could have hyperinflation with the near future, would cause problems for everybody around the world?
Well, yeah, Pakistan's an interesting case. I'm following it pretty carefully. The big problem in Pakistan is the central bank. So they have to get rid of the central bank. And you say, well, what are they going to do? And you do what they have. You have something called a currency board, like they have in Hong Kong, and they would produce a rupee, and it would be, let's say, if the dollar was the anchor currency, the rupee would trade at a fixed exchange rate with the U.S. dollar. The rupee would be backed 100% with U.S. dollar reserves, and the rupee would be a clone of the U.S. dollar, and the problem is going to be solved. And the way it would be solved is that the currency board would put a hard budget constraint on the fiscal authorities in Pakistan. That's the problem. In other words, the fiscal authorities couldn't go to the central bank and sell them bonds. The only way the fiscal authorities actually could get more rupees is to take dollars in and exchange them at the fixed exchange rate for rupee. So that is the big problem, and they think, unfortunately, that the IMF is going to somehow bail them out. And these IMF programs, one of the biggest recidivists is Pakistan. I think it's the number 2 country. I think Haiti has had more IMF programs by 1 or 2 than Pakistan. I think Pakistan's now has had 22 IMF programs, and they'll fail. They all fail. And they fail because the IMF is telling Pakistan what they should do. It's back to the Hungarian, your colleague from Hungary. These problems are created locally, and they have to be solved locally. They're not solved by the IMF coming in with credit. Okay, the IMF can put a Band-Aid on the thing for a little while, and the IMF says, oh, we'll give you the money, but you have to do this, that, and the other thing. Well, they never do this, that, or the other thing. They basically just ignore the IMF. The whole thing blows up again, and you start over. So the real problem is getting rid of the state bank and the central bank in Pakistan. That's what I've been advocating. And the inflation rate is, I measure it every day, and let me just see where we're at here. Just a second. My Twitter is acting up.
It was 43%. I think you posted it earlier today.
Did you look at it? Okay, you're ahead of me. Let's see. Yeah, Pakistan. You're right. So that's the story in Pakistan. Pakistan's an interesting case study because it just illustrates the source of the problem is always a central bank, and the idea that somehow there's an international institution that's going to come in and rescue you, it just doesn't hold water. I mean, and Pakistan's a very good example. So, thank you.
Hi, my name is Teresa, and I'm a rising junior at William Jewell College in Missouri. My question for you today is, how much do you think inflationary expectations actually affect the level of inflation, or do you believe that they do at all?
I think they do affect the duration of the inflation. I don't think they significantly affect the level so much, but if once people think that inflation is going to be around, what do? Well, they start asking for higher wages the next time they go in for a contract, and so it tends to stretch things out and maybe amplify it a little bit. But it's quite important, and right now the inflation expectations are in fact pretty low, because if you look at the market, what's the market think the average inflation rate's going to be over the next 2 years? 3.6%. That's what the market actually thinks. I think the market's wrong. I gave you the numbers. The end of this year, 7%. The end of next year, the year-over-year inflation, 5 or 6%. So that's a lot higher than the markets think. Now, what the implication is, of course, is that the bond market is going to get killed some more, because your question, the inflation, this can't keep on forever, this temporary kind of thing, because people actually think the Fed can solve the problem very rapidly, and they can't because of what's left in the bathtub. Remember that 30% cumulative increase, that residual that's left, that's going to come out of the bathtub with a lag of about 12 to 24 months. That's going to be coming out, and all of a sudden, I think the inflation expectations could become, as they call it, unanchored and kind of unstable. But we'll see. Right now, I think the inflation expectations are very well anchored, and the market is dramatically underestimating the amount of inflation we're going to be having.
Hello, my name is Ben Puffer. I go to Brigham Young University. I just wanted to thank you for speaking here tonight. Thank you so much. My question revolves around how you touched on how the Federal Reserve officials currently mock the quantity theory of money, and I was curious, if they're rejecting that theory, that formula, what are the other schools of thought that they're appealing to? What are their other models, or is it entirely ad hoc?
Well, the biggest thing, are you ready for this?
Yes.
It's a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. So go check that out.
Sorry, one more time.
The dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. That is what we have had for 30 years in macroeconomics. And if you want to publish anything in the top peer-reviewed journals in macroeconomics and you're not using that model, forget it. You're not going to get published. So it's basically destroyed macroeconomics. But and it is a model that does not contain. They don't contain money. Money is not in the model. So anyway, you can go Google that when you.
I definitely will. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Brockton Yoder. I'm a recent graduate of Purdue. My question's kind of simple, but I was just kind of wondering if inflation is caused by printing money and paying off debts. What's the point of printing money? Why is our government doing today? Kind of what is the argument for that even?
You mean why are they producing too much money?
Well, just kind of like, yeah, why are they printing money off if it causes inflation? Like, what's the point of actually doing that? Why wouldn't you try to do that as least as possible?
The point was to accommodate the fiscal authorities, basically. I mean, the fiscal authority, the budget isn't balanced. It's got a deficit, and the idea was, if you call it idea, we can get you off the hook, basically, because we'll buy the bonds and you won't have to sell them to the general public, because if they sold them to the general public, by the way, the interest rates would go up, because as the supply goes up, the price of bonds goes down and the interest rate goes up. Or to look at it another way, to induce you to purchase bonds, they're going to have to give you a little higher interest rate maybe than they had before. So this, I think, was a lot, there were a lot of currents going around, and it's actually hard to fathom what they were thinking about, because there were some months where the growth rate in the money supply was on a monthly basis like 65%. I mean, it was huge. You don't have to be a rocket scientist from Purdue to figure out that this is going to be a problem.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm told we only have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take the person at the mic on each side, and maybe Professor Hanke can stay and answer a few more questions here.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that, Roger.
Thank you for coming out here today, sir. My name is Jair Likai. I'm a rising senior at Fordham University, and my question just wanted to touch base a little bit more on the supply chain issue, which I agree with you on the basis that although it is an easy excuse, I would argue that it is more prevalent than what you're trying to describe it to be, at least through my personal experience. One of the examples you cited as a result of the printing of money and the trend of economic notions as a result of COVID was the increase of the price of used cars, you said, correct? Was that not directly correlated to the chip shortage?
Yeah, well, there was the supply chain problem is a pure supply and demand kind of problem. The price index, you have to look at the consumer price index has 299 items in it. And the index goes up and down depending on the equation MV equals PY. That's what makes the thing go up and down. Now, the supply chain problem and the used car problem is a change in relative prices. The prices of, in fact, the relative prices, it started out, the used cars were actually going up faster than the new cars. So supply and demand, I mean, just draw your supply and demand diagram. Oil has gone up tremendously. That's a supply and demand thing. The price of oil has gone up relative to other things. So things in the basket are moving around. The level of the basket is the consumer price index. So that's a confusion. The confusion is between relative price changes, the cars, the oil, gasoline, and the consumer price index, where the whole thing is going up, the kind of weighted average of all these 299 items that's in the index, that's going up or going down. So that's the MV equals PY business. And one way to look at this, if you look at Japan during the 1970s, as you know, we had an oil crisis. We had 2 oil crises. We had the one starting in 1973, and if you look at Japan, it's a good case study, because what happened, they allowed the money supply to go up to kind of, shall we say, cushion the shock of the oil shock that occurred in 1973. And inflation went up. Oil prices went up. The relative price of oil went up, but the overall index went up. The second one that started in 1979, the Japanese learned their lesson, and they said, oh, we're not going to goose the money supply to accommodate this problem we have with the relative price of oil going up. We'll let the relative price of oil go up, but we'll try to keep the money supply growing at about the same level. And as a result, if you look at Japan in the second oil shock, the inflation stayed more or less right where it was before the oil shock started. So this is a lesson in relative prices versus the absolute level of prices going up in a big index like the consumer price index.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, sir. I'm Markwad. I'm also coming from Hungary, and I can call myself proudly to be a billionaire because I also do have 2 billion bill. Unfortunately, it currently worth around like 10 US dollars, probably. I don't even know. But anyway,
as collectibles now, they're actually worth much more than they
that's
were.
True. That's true. Hopefully, it's going to worth 2 billion as well. Anyway, My question is, can you actually name a country who is doing a very efficient monetary politics when it comes to inflation, for example? So we see that inflation is a problem everywhere around the world, but can you name at least one or two countries who is doing very well?
I gave you three. China is the best one. Communist China follows Milton Friedman. They use the quantity theory of money. These people are a little bit smarter than you think, and there are a lot of them. 2.1% is the inflation rate. It is due to the fact that the money supply, they follow MV equals PY, and they have it about right. Japan is suffering from what they consider to be a very high inflation, 2.5%. So they have increased the money supply, and the inflation has come up. It was essentially about 0, and it's come up to about 2. But it's still very, very low relative to other places. Switzerland, of course, always the king in these things, 2.9%. So you've got 3 countries that prove or demonstrate the point that inflation it's not a global problem. It's a global problem. Why? Because everybody copies the Federal Reserve. I mean, the king of all central banks is the Federal Reserve. And so there tends to be mimicking of whatever the Fed is doing, you have a lot of followers.
All right, thank you. You've been a great audience.
Yeah, good.